taking a look at the photographs gives me great joy, but it's because I know I took that picture. I was actually there. I took a picture along the trail with an ordinary camera and actually was able to position my face in the corner of the frame as if it was a selfie with an iPhone where I could see what I was doing. I sent the picture to a whole bunch of friends, and the subject heading was, I went to Norway. One of my friends who likes playing with Photoshop sent the picture back where he had superimposed his face over mine, and the subject heading was, so did I. And I just thought, Jack, you can make it look like you were in Norway, but you weren't in Norway. You just didn't get those same experiences. You didn't get the satisfaction of plopping down at night in a hut, knowing how much you had hiked that day, how you'd put in 30,000 steps. And it's so rewarding for me. I know that when my parents were alive and I was hiking as a young man, they just never understood it. You've got the comforts of home. You can go to the park. Why would you subject yourself to this? And I can't really explain it to people who don't do it and don't understand it. But it's an adventure that's not dangerous. It's not true mountain climbing. It's not skydiving, but it's rewarding, and the views are just amazing.
I don't believe I've ever started a show with such a long quote, particularly one that wasn't directly about what they were actually doing. But I just love what our guest today, Fred, said about some of the joy he gets from going on an adventure, why it's different, why this kind of travel is different. That's one of the things I'm trying to convey and encourage you to get out there and do. There's something about adventure travel that gets in your soul, that makes you feel good about yourself, proud of yourself, and makes you feel like you can conquer the world. Today we'll be hiking Norway on a hut-to-hut adventure where we also stop in some of the towns and get to see what is normally an extraordinarily expensive country in a much more affordable way and a much more up-close and personal way to interact with the landscape. I can't wait to share it with you, so let's get started. Welcome to the Active Travel Adventures podcast. I'm your host, Kit Parks. I'm excited to bring you back to Norway, a country we first visited several years ago. Our guest today is Fred, who went on an exciting Norway adventure with my new affiliate, IAG, International Adventure Guides. Welcome to the program, Fred. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get started, how about telling us a little bit about who Fred is so we know what your background is, your experience, and all that in adventure travel?
All right. Fred is originally a Bostonian, although I've been living in Brooklyn for many, many years. I'll never be a New Yorker because I still root for the Red Sox and the Patriots. I enjoyed hiking in New England as a youth. I went hiking and backpacking quite a bit back in high school when we used backpacks with exterior frames, and always kind of missed it. And then many years later, living in Brooklyn, this fellow named Kevin, who you already mentioned, opened up an outdoor outfitter shop in our neighborhood. And he talked about guiding trips. And then I was crazy enough to go on a roughly 7-day trip with him to Iceland around 2014, I think. And then he had another trip, and that's the topic of our discussion today, I guess, the Norway trip, which was in 2016.
We actually went to Norway once on the Active Travel Adventures podcast, way back in episode number 40, where I interviewed Sherry Ott about St. Olav Ways, a long-distance pilgrimage trail. But this is a completely different trip. How did you decide that Norway was going to be your next adventure?
That's a good question, and I don't know that I have a good answer. More than anything, I just liked the idea of hiking in a beautiful place with beautiful scenery and going someplace I'd never been before. Also, I guess I will have to confess, I needed to do something that was affordable, and this worked out well for all of those things. It's not like, oh gosh, I need to go to Norway to go hiking. It was more like, wow, this looks like a good opportunity, and my wife is okay with it, so let's do it.
You don't often hear Norway and affordable in the same sentence, so that's pretty cool. So did your wife go with you, or did you go on your own?
Absolutely not. Her idea of hiking is a day trip north of New York City, hopefully no more than a couple of hours away by car, getting to see wonderful foliage and birds, and then coming home, showering, and not having to carry 35 to 40 pounds.
That's actually one reason why I like guided adventure tours, because you can go solo and go into the backcountry but not be alone. My late husband Bill was exactly like your wife. And like your wife, my Bill was cool with me going by myself as long as I didn't try to drag him along. How about giving us a general overview of your trip, and then we'll dive down a little deeper?
Sure. So we flew into Bergen in Norway. We stayed at a very nice hotel the first night. Then we drove to a small town called Voss. We had lunch. And by the end of the day, we had arrived at Fondsbu to our cabins where we stayed that night. One of the interesting things along the way was a drive through an incredibly long tunnel through the mountains. It's the first time I've ever been in a tunnel that had rest stops for cars to pull over.
Well, let me stop you for a minute. That's pretty cool. How long do you think this tunnel was?
I have the number 26 miles in my head, but I'll be the first to admit that I hope I never have to testify under oath to that. But it was miles and miles of tunnel.
That's one long tunnel. Were you going under a mountain or underwater?
I'm pretty sure we were going through mountains. We ended up driving along the fjords and through the mountains.
That's really amazing. I'm going to have to do some research on that.
Yes.
I'm sorry to have interrupted you too. That just struck me as really cool.
Well, again, I hope I didn't horribly exaggerate. Maybe it was 26 kilometers, which would only be about 14, 15 miles.
Regardless, that's a long time to be in the dark.
Right. Well, we weren't in the dark. It was very well lit, but there is a little bit of monotony. And I vaguely remember a discussion about safety in tunnels because people can become almost hypnotized while driving through the same condition over and over again. But it all worked out fine. It was part of the adventure. I believe we started the hike on day 3. And please, as we've discussed by email, forgive my pronunciations, but we went from Fondsbu to Olavsbu, which was 8.6 miles, and we stayed in the first hut. On the next day, we went from Olavsbu to, I'm going to butcher this horribly, Skogelsbøen, which was 11 and a half miles, and we stayed in another hut. The next day, we went from Skogelsbøen to Ingerbu, 8 miles. And then the 4th day of hiking, we went to Jotunheimen Visitor Center, which was a 10-mile hike. That night, if I recall correctly, we stayed at the Knives Hotel in Balestrand, and that was really nice. We relaxed the next day. We looked around the town a little bit. On day 8, we ended up taking a ferry back through the fjords to Bergen, and that was really beautiful. It was really amazing. And then we departed on the morning of day 9 of the trip.
So now on the hikes themselves, how difficult of a trip is this? I mean, is this something you have to be super trained for? Are you doing a lot of elevation, ascents and descents, or talk a little bit about that?
Well, so at this point, I was about 60 years old, and I would never consider myself an athlete, and I did fine. There is a lot of hiking up and a lot of hiking down. It's a workout. There's no question about it. But I think anyone in decent shape would be able to do this hike. The thing that made this hike more difficult than some others was sadly the lack of snow. So there was a lot of what had been, Kevin told us, hiking over packed snow relatively easily when he surveyed the hike the year before. This time we were going over a lot of rocky territory. So you had to kind of take each step carefully. But once you got used to that, it was really fine. And I would think that if a middle-aged, slightly overweight, 60-year-old guy from Brooklyn can do this hike, pretty much anyone would be able to do this hike.
Would you recommend somebody train? Is this something somebody should be, well, with that kind of mileage anyway, somebody should train anyway. You don't just go all of a sudden hike, 8, 10, 11 miles in a day in the mountains.
Oh, I completely agree. And I think that training for a hike like this would be a good idea. For this hike, I think I had started doing one of those high intensity 7-minute workouts, and I started doing stair running in my apartment building, which only goes up 5 flights. And I probably didn't even do enough training, but it all worked out fine.
And now you said you had 30 to 40 pounds on you. You're staying in huts, which I want to ask you a little bit more about that part later. So were you bringing a lot of change of clothes or something? Usually if I'm backpacking, I pretty much wear the same stuff over and over again.
I'm first of all, to be transparent, I'm guessing on the weight. We didn't have to bring a sleeping bag, nor a tent, nor a fly, because we were staying in the huts, as you pointed out. And I may be conflating the load on this trip with the load on the Iceland trip. On the Iceland trip, we did bring sleeping bags, which we did not need to bring on this trip. I probably brought more clothing than I needed. I try to have one full set of clothes to wear on a hike like this and one complete set of clothes in case I fall in the mud and get everything soaked and ruined. I probably had one extra layer in case I was cold and wet, which did happen. It didn't really get cold, but it did get wet. So on the weight, I am guessing I may have brought some extra snacks, and I'm pretty sure I brought a backup battery for my camera. I remember as a youth, some of the guys I went hiking with would snip the little tags off of their tea bags to lighten their loads. And I just remembered thinking, well, this is silly. At most, if I save a pound, is that really going to make a difference? You've probably done this more than I have. Maybe it does make a difference, and maybe I'm foolish not to snip off the ends of the tea bags and cut the handles off my toothbrush to make them lighter.
Let's talk about the landscape itself. What did you see? Like, what are the kinds of things that you saw? What are the striking memories you have?
The landscape is just amazing. You can't put this stuff into words. It's rocky, it's mountainous, it's snow-capped, it's green, it's gray. Oh, here I am trying to put it into words. I'm actually skimming through the brochure to look at some of the pictures. I sent you some pictures, and I hope that people can see them on your website when they're listening to this, before or after. I used to be a photographer in my youth. I used to take a lot of pictures, but I didn't really take that many pictures on this trip. I only carried a lightweight compact camera, and I still got what I think are some amazing photos of the huts, of the scenery, the waterfall. I can't remember now exactly where we saw this amazing waterfall. You basically make a turn on the trail, and there's an outlook over the edge, and you're looking across a valley sort of towards another mountain. And it's like, oh my God, look at that. It's an amazing waterfall. The fjords were astounding. And even in the villages and the towns, there was just so much color and so much to see.
Do you think they make the homes colorful because it does get the dark gray snow, the overcast of winter? Do you think that helps cheer people up?
I can't speculate, but yeah, if you said to me, you want to make a bet, I'd go at least 50 cents. And I usually only bet people a nickel. So sure.
Yeah, because looking at the photos you sent, they're just joyful.
Yes,
The homes are just joyfully colored.
absolutely.
And the photos I have seen of Norway have always just been striking. It's almost like a postcard everywhere you're looking. It looks like it should be a postcard.
Right, right. It was, I think one of the things that strikes me is, and I think I showed this in my photos, there are places where I guess you're above the tree line and there's a little bit of moss, a little bit of grass, but basically you're looking at earth and rock, and it's brown and it's gray, and it's also snow capped. So you get the color in that way, but basically it's not very colorful. But then if you look at some of the other pictures, when we're at lower elevations near the huts, there's even grass on the roof of the huts. I mean, bright green grass. It's just astounding to me.
And do the lakes have that, I call it like the glacial colors, where they're like turquoisey and these like really odd, beautiful, clear blues?
You know, I wish I could say that were the case, but I didn't see that, not firsthand, at least not for myself.
Okay, so but I'll have to look into see that, because when I was at Glacier National Park and then also in New Zealand, the glacial silt will get into some of the lakes and it bounces off the blue, or you can't see the blue, and it makes it look really blue to us.
Oh, that's interesting.
And you saw glaciers in Norway, if I'm not mistaken, right?
We did. We didn't really on this particular trip. It's not like we were on the glaciers or that close to them. I'm just skimming through my pictures now, and I'm looking at some of the fjords that we were actually on, and the hotel was next to the hotel in the Knives in Balestrand. And I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, but we didn't actually climb onto or get that close to any glaciers. It was also overcast a fair amount of the time that we were there, so we might have missed some of the color because we didn't get all the light that one might get on the lakes.
I've seen some amazing photos of fjords, but I've not seen one myself in person. Are they caused by the rivers carving us through the mountains? Is it a river, or do you know what they are?
I'm pretty sure that is the case. Glacial melting, rivers going through the canyons. It's funny. It did remind me of being out west in the United States, in the Southwest, but much wider. Even the Colorado, you can raft down the Colorado, but you can't take a cruise ship down the Colorado. And these fjords, at one point we looked over while we were driving to or from someplace, I don't recall, and there was a huge cruise ship in the fjord with what I would think was not a whole lot of water on either side. I remembered thinking, I'm glad I'm not the captain of that boat.
Definitely. Yeah, no, that's cool. And that could be part of it too. If it's a river, it may not get that color. Maybe it's the lakes that get it. I don't know. I'll have to do some more research on that. So let's go back to your trip itself and the mountain huts. There's a bit of variety from what I read. Some had more amenities than others. Can you talk a little bit about the kinds of places that you stayed in those huts?
Sure. It's funny to me that they're referred to as huts, because when somebody says hut, I picture a relatively rudimentary structure. And to me, it would be more appropriate to say that these were akin to log cabins. One of the huts was relatively small. It had a wood-burning stove. It had a rudimentary kitchen. If I recall, there was liquid propane for cooking with gas in the kitchen. And it's funny, they had a really old-fashioned, it looked to me like I remembered thinking, wow, that's a medieval padlock on the door. And to get the key, again, if I recall correctly, you have to join the Norwegian Trekking Society, and then it entitles you to use of the huts for 1 year. And Kevin had gotten the key. There were a couple of hikers, a pair of women from Germany who were waiting on the porch out of the rain, hoping that somebody like us would show up so that they could actually sleep in a hut instead of in their tent one night. And that was one of the nice things that I liked about the huts. You got to be out of any rain and elements. You got to sleep in a real bed. we brought sleeping bag liners because, if I understand correctly, basically they put sheets on the bed at the beginning of the season and take the sheets off the bed at the end of the season. So you don't really want to be in contact. And so we brought sleeping bag liners to sleep in on top of the sheets. It was great, though. We got to cook and relax. We got to hang our clothes to dry and put our boots by the fire so they were nice and dry and warm in the morning. That was one of the huts that I remember relatively small. Another one of the huts had a full kitchen, and they had service and they had showers. And it was almost like a fairly rustic hotel. So it's really funny to me how much they vary from basically, oh, here's a cabin in the woods where you can light a stove and make dinner. And here's another huge hut with lots of people. Everyone is always very friendly, and you can actually get a meal there, not have to bring your own food.
Cool. And I'm sure you can figure that out ahead of time as well. Talk about the food a little bit. What kind of food did you eat, and was it good?
I am like a 6-year-old American boy who basically eats, the examples I use are, noodles and chicken nuggets. That's an exaggeration, but it sets a good tone for who I am. On one of the nights at one of the huts, the featured item was pea soup. I hate peas. I hate pea soup. But I remember, I think according to my Fitbit or my Apple Watch, whatever I had at the time, we had gone well over 30,000 steps. I think it was probably the longest I'd ever hiked. It was probably the day we went 11 and a half miles. And I got to tell you, that pea soup was delicious. It was outstanding. And I ate up every drop with the bread that I'm pretty sure they made there. And it was really delicious. Trying to think of another meal that we ate. There's a lot of like meats like ham and stuff like that, and a lot of hearty bread. And if I recall, I can't remember now whether we did this at dinner the night before or if we did it at breakfast. You'd have yogurt, granola, and the typical hearty breakfast that you might expect. And then you make a sandwich with the meats and the bread to bring to have for lunch during the trip.
And were you provided with ample food?
Oh, absolutely. There was more than enough food. Again, for me, with that taste of a 6-year-old boy, some of the stuff I looked at, and I have to confess, I don't remember what it was. I've never been a big yogurt eater. If you like yogurt and fresh fruit, if I recall, there was plenty of that. You could make toast. There were cheeses and meats. It was a little unusual for me because I'm not a hearty breakfast eater. But then again, I don't usually go out and hike 11 and a half miles with a pack. So Kevin always encouraged us to really have a good, substantial breakfast. And I didn't do that well in that department because I'm much more of a big dinner eater. But I would say the food was very good. And to be clear, I might have been influenced by the fact that I burned a lot of calories and was very hungry and tired at the end of each day. So I've always thought that when hiking, food somehow tastes better. Even when I used to eat freeze-dried food, I think it was beef stroganoff in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And it was probably horrible, but I remembered thinking as a teenager, wow, this is pretty good.
Yeah, I think it takes like 3 days on the trail before everything tastes so good.
Absolutely.
So that's one of the things I like about backpacking. And then I want to ask you one more question too about the huts. When you're in these huts, are these dorm style, or do you have some privacy, or how does that work?
It varied, and I don't recall as well as I should, considering this was only about 5 years ago. I can recall that at least one of the huts, there were rooms with either one or two bunk beds. In one of the huts, I have a recollection of a more dormitory style bedding. So it really varied, if I recall, depending on the huts. I wish I could give you a better answer, but I just don't really recall, except that there was variation. And again, I think I may be conflating my Iceland trip with my Norway trip, because I'm picturing a big dormitory in one of the huts we stayed in, but I'm also picturing enough people that was probably the Iceland trip. I can definitely picture on the Norway trip a relatively small room with either one or two bunk beds. And I know that Kevin was in a separate room, and the pair of German hikers, the two of them were also in a separate room. So I don't know how good an answer that gives you, but it's what I've got.
So it sounds like there's a mix, and each hut has its own personality, basically.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about Bergen, and didn't you get a chance to see some of the sites and learn a little bit about the history there, or there was some free time and some scheduled time? Tell us about the city life, what y'all did there.
So Bergen is a really adorable little waterside town. It's not on the ocean. I don't know if it's a fjord or a lake. There's an open market. There are lots of places to eat. I'm just looking. I remember, I think one of the photos I sent you is actually an old white clapboard building, and it's actually a McDonald's that doesn't look really horrible and annoying. There is a funicular which goes to the top of Mount Fløyen. And again, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And there was a beautiful view of the city, and we watched the sunset go down. The next morning, Nancy and I decided to walk around the city. We went to a museum. There's a park with sort of a pond or a lake in the middle. And just walking around, it was just lovely there. There were little shops, I guess, which I didn't really care that much about. There was some beautiful graffiti, if I recall correctly. And I think it was the kind of graffiti that is not discouraged. It was politely placed where it was appropriate. It wasn't across people's storefronts and such. It was really, it was just really adorable. And I loved the open market. I think we got food for lunch there one day. There's a lot of fresh fish and things of that nature, of course, as one shouldn't be surprised. I don't remember if or what there was for nightlife. I have a vague recollection of having a beer in a bar after hours with Kevin. He has been known to enjoy a beer now and then, and encouraged me quite nicely to do so. So that was fun.
And we've had problems doing the pronunciation, but is it like many countries up there where they speak perfect English and it doesn't make a difference if you can't speak Norwegian?
I don't remember having a conversation with anyone where they indicated that they just didn't understand what we were saying. It wasn't a problem at all. I remember years and years ago getting lost in Paris and trying to ask people for help. And I don't know if they were being nasty or just didn't have the time or just didn't speak English. But it was hard for me many years ago to get help finding my way back to a hotel in Paris. In Bergen, that was never an issue. Mind you, the town is so small that it was hard to get lost.
But even asking a simple question, just in Iceland too, same thing.
Same thing.
Everybody spoke perfect English.
Absolutely. This is, if you're going to try to get away and have an exotic place where no one understands the language, then you don't want to go here. But frankly, that wasn't my intent. And I love the fact that I could communicate quite well with everyone, as I recall.
And so let's talk a little bit about the group that you went with. How big of a group was it? What types of people were there? A couple solos like yourself? Or what was the configuration?
Well, the Norway trip, I think, was really an exception because there was only one other person signed up for the trip with us. And I remember talking to Kevin and telling him ahead of buying the airline ticket, which I think was non-refundable. It's like, listen, Kevin, you're doing this to make a living. and you're entitled. I don't want you to lose money to take me to Norway. And he insisted, he said, you booked the trip, we're doing the trip. So that particular trip, the Norway trip in 2016, was only myself and one other person named Nancy. She lived in Brooklyn, coincidentally, not that far from me. And I think this was her first trip. So she was very excited, as was I. And she did really well on the trip. We kept joking and sort of spurring each other on, especially at the end of the longest hike. It's like, you're doing great. No, you're doing great. And it was funny because she was very nervous about the idea of going on a 4-day trek of this nature, but she did just fine. And again, I'm pretty sure without prior hiking experience.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's quite bold, because you're probably, as I'm assuming, in the middle of nowhere too. That once you start out, you're out until you're done.
Yes, absolutely. You're practically in the middle of nowhere.
I love it like that.
Absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about the typical day's hiking. Like, what was the schedule like?
We hiked. So I think I've said, it's funny that you ask several times, and I probably will say it several more times. By nature, I'm a night owl, and I go to bed way too late, and I wake up if I'm not working way too late. When in a situation like this, you're typically so tired, there's no television. You can sit around talking and catching up with people and such, but generally, we end up going to bed relatively early, certainly for me at least. So waking up early is not really an issue to make sure you get plenty of sunlight. We do the trip during August. So again, sun is setting late. In Iceland, if I recall, the sun barely set at all. I can't really remember what it was like so much in Norway. A lot of the time it was overcast, unfortunately. But you wake up, you get yourself organized. Thankfully, coffee is already being made by our guide and cook, Kevin. Couldn't manage to do these trips without coffee, and thankfully don't have to. And then we basically get on the trail and stopping occasionally if somebody's tired, if somebody needs a break. But generally, I would say we keep moving. Speaking for myself, I'm better off with short breaks so that my muscles don't tighten up. And then I like to get moving again. I find that I can just keep moving. I'm a little bit like a shark. I'm not necessarily going very fast, but I do better when I'm moving along. We would then stop when everyone agreed that it was a nice place, or if it was a place that Kevin had scouted on a previous trip, to have lunch. We'd use, boulders as our tables and just enjoy our lunch and hang out for a little while. After lunch, we'd get back on the trail. And I think we would typically hike until we got to the next hut. On occasion, there'd be a nice overlook, and we'd always stop and look at that. I vaguely remember that the waterfall that I think I sent you a picture of, it was one of those stops along the way. We may have gone slightly off the trail to a scenic overlook, but generally speaking, I would say we kept moving. And it's not like we were rushing past beautiful scenery. We were right in the middle of beautiful scenery wherever we were looking.
So how long, or rather how late into the day do you hike?
Late afternoon. On the longest day, we did finish into the evening. We were hiking, come to think of it, I remember now, we put on our headlights or our headlamps to finish maybe the last mile of the trip on the day 4, I believe, when we did 11 and a half miles.
And so you mentioned going in August. I imagine the only time you can really do this is in the summertime.
I would think. Yeah, there may be people who do this in tougher weather, but I think the season for the huts being open is really basically the month of August. I want to make it clear, I don't know this for sure, but that's the impression I have.
And was there something that you wished you'd packed or wished you'd known that you could say, oh man, I wish I'd known to do this or thought to bring this?
The only thing that I can think of is we got sleeping bag liners to use in the huts so that we weren't sleeping on the sheets, which, as I mentioned, have been there since the beginning of the season and been slept on by who knows how many people. If I were to do this again and I knew I had huts that had mattresses and bedding and comforters, I probably would have just brought a top sheet and a bottom sheet, maybe a pillowcase. I think it would have been a little bit lighter and a little bit more comfortable for me to sleep in, as opposed to the sleeping bag liner, which kind of makes you feel like you're in a cocoon. Some people might like that sort of thing. It's not my favorite thing. Other than that, if I recall, the packing list that we were given was pretty comprehensive. It didn't overdo it. So the equipment was all supplied. So there was nothing that I could think of for equipment. I know that we used trekking poles, which as a youth, I never used, but was glad that they were part of the supplies that came for this trip. The headlamps that I mentioned earlier, even those were included as part of the equipment that we were given. The only thing that we had to go out and get was the outerwear, really. If I recall, we had to get everything synthetic as far as clothing, no cotton, nothing that would stay wet. I even have a couple of pairs of antibacterial underwear, which apparently won't smell if you wear them a day or two longer than perhaps you should while out on the trail.
Good to know on that.
There is one suggestion I would have for people, knowing that I did a trip to Iceland a few years later. I did a trip to Norway, but I'm not a regular avid hiker. I decided not to spring for the higher quality rain pants, so they didn't zip all the way up each leg. So one day when it did start to rain and we decided, all right, it's raining enough that we're going to stop and put on our rain gear, I could not pull my rain pants up over my hiking boots without taking off my boots. Had I sprung for the rain pants that zipped all the way up each side, I would have been able to put them on without taking off the boots, and that would have been nice.
Nice. Yeah, I was about to say, if it wasn't on the list, I would highly recommend rain pants in addition to, I'm sure, the rain jacket. I would also recommend waterproof gloves. Was that on the list?
Yeah, I don't recall that waterproof gloves were on the list, but I had a pair of wool gloves. So they did get quite wet. And I remember one day eating my lunch in a drizzle, and my hands were quite wet. But I remember vividly thinking, it's true that they say that wool keeps you warm even when it's wet, and they dry really quickly. So that was fine for me.
Learned my lesson when I was in Scotland at the West Highland Way in just a brutal cold rain. And a friend a couple of days later said, oh, they have waterproof gloves. I was like, who knew? I didn't even know they made such a thing. And now I'm just sold. I love them. But it's true what you say about the wool. Same with the wool socks as well. Wear those because if your feet get drenched, at least your feet won't be cold. And then speaking, when you're talking about the rocks, I'm guessing you should be wearing hiking boots rather than hiking shoes, or unless you have super strong ankles, or any recommendations there?
I don't feel like I'm the person who should be giving advice, but that never stops me. The first trip I went on with Kevin, I wore fairly substantial, heavy boots, and a cousin of mine who was on the trip wore much lighter weight trekking shoes that really didn't even go above the ankle. And I'm beginning to think that he did the right thing because they're so much lighter and they were waterproof. In Norway, I kind of got boots that were in the middle. They weren't the old clunky boots of my youth, but neither were they the kind of trekking shoes that day hikers might use. So for me, I recommend something mid-weight that maybe gets up to the ankle. Of course, ideally waterproof. That I think is the most important thing, because there's always going to be water on the trail. There's always going to be puddles. And I still remember vividly the very first hike I ever went on in the White Mountains. Oh, the trails up the hill become little streams whenever there's water.
So true.
You've mentioned Kevin and IAG a couple of times. How did you choose them, and what is it that you like about them as a company?
I stumbled onto Kevin, so to speak. He opened up an outfitter shop in my neighborhood, just a few blocks away. I'd stop in on occasion and sort of reminisce about when I was younger and went hiking on a somewhat regular basis. And then he mentioned that he was doing this Iceland trip. And I thought, wow, this sounds crazy. I think I want to do this. I did a little bit of research looking into other options because, after all, who was this guy, Kevin? Seemed like a nice guy, seemed to know what he was doing. Everything else I looked at was, if I recall, rather expensive compared to Kevin. And I just got the feeling right away that he knew what he was doing. I know that he and one of his employees had scouted the trail the year before, and I mentioned something along those lines to him, and he just looked at me and he said, I'm not going to take you hiking where I haven't been before. And I will admit, I felt like I was taking a little bit of a chance, but it worked out great on the Iceland trip, and certainly good enough that I decided to do the Norway trip with him. He definitely seems to do the preparation. He had all the equipment. He made sure that our backpacks fit properly. We went to his place ahead of time and chose, which size backpack. We got a list of equipment that we would need to either already have or purchase well ahead of time. And one of the things that I also like about Kevin is he's fun on the trail. He's got a sense of humor that I guess to some degree is similar to mine. The risk of scaring off any potential clients, he does like a good dad joke now and then, even though he's not a dad, but I've got that covered for the two of us. And he's very personable and very encouraging when we were on the trail. So I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but that's what I've got.
So it sounds like you're happy with the logistical planning and how everything worked out tour-wise. That's great.
And I felt like I was in good hands. Absolutely.
So do you have any other adventures planned coming up?
I don't at the moment. Sadly with COVID, I just don't have anything coming up. I turn 65 next year, so my knees and my hips just aren't as in good shape as they used to be. I believe that Kevin has a trip in Hawaii where they do a lot of day hiking, but don't actually stay out in the wilderness. And I've been working on my wife to go on that trip.
Is there a favorite story that you think of when people ask you about Norway that is the one that comes to mind?
There really isn't a particular favorite story. What for me works best as far as fond memories is, I look at the pictures and in fact, I'm going to click on my little library of pictures that I sent. There's one picture in particular towards the end where it's a picture of a tiny little hut by the edge of a lake. It's surrounded by greenery with the base of a mountain in the background. And I grew up in Boston and then the suburbs and have lived in Brooklyn for many, many years. And it's just scenery that you don't get anywhere else. And that's the reason, I think, more than anything, that I do trips like this. Taking a look at the photographs gives me great joy, but it's because I know I took that picture. I was actually there. I took a picture along the trail with an ordinary camera and actually was able to position my face in the corner of the frame as if it was a selfie with an iPhone where I could see what I was doing. I sent the picture to a whole bunch of friends, and the subject heading was, I went to Norway. One of my friends who likes playing with Photoshop sent the picture back where he had superimposed his face over mine, and the subject heading was, so did I. And I just thought, Jack, you can make it look like you were in Norway, but you weren't in Norway. You just didn't get those same experiences. You didn't get the satisfaction of plopping down at night in a hut, knowing how much you had hiked that day, how you'd put in 30,000 steps. And it's so rewarding for me. I know that when my parents were alive and I was hiking as a young man, they just never understood it. You've got the comforts of home. You can go to the park. Why would you subject yourself to this? And I can't really explain it to people who don't do it and don't understand it. But it's an adventure that's not dangerous. It's not true mountain climbing. It's not skydiving, but it's rewarding, and the views are just amazing.
But the funny thing is I think when people do these kinds of things and go on a real adventure, they get addicted. And that's what happened to me. That's why this podcast exists. Is I didn't know people could do things like this. And when a friend invited me to go to Nicaragua, I said, "Oh, I guess I could do that." I was like, "Oh my gosh, I can do things like this." And it was just amazing. It just totally changed my world. Is there anything that I should have asked you about your trip that I did not, that you'd like to share with us, or any final thoughts that you'd like to let people know about this trip and whether or not they should go on it?
In all fairness, I'm going to be transparent. I hope that I gave a very good impression of Kevin and his organization. The fact that all of the necessary equipment was available, that was great. I think there was a nice balance of free time and organized time. We got to enjoy a really nice ferry ride through a fjord to get back from the second hotel, the hotel that we stayed at, the Knives Hotel in Balestrand or Balestrand, to get back to Bergen for one night before flying off the next morning. And that was wonderful. I don't know how most hikers feel about being on a fairly sizable ferry and just going through the fjords in Norway and looking at the scenery, but it was a great way to relax and chill out at the end of 4 days of fairly significant hiking. If you're going to go on a trip like this, I think it's an important thing to compromise between bringing a good camera versus bringing a camera that's too big and too heavy. I had a compact camera, not an SLR, that I thought took very reasonable pictures, and I'm glad I had it with me. I had an extra battery, and I probably had an extra memory card for it, which I don't think I needed because it was able to hold plenty of pictures. I liked the idea of having, again, at the time, I don't remember whether it was a Fitbit or an Apple Watch, but the day that I did something like 33,000 steps, I remembered thinking, that is pretty cool. Look what I've done. So that was great.
On the travels that you've done in the past, how does this trip rate compared to other things that you've done, other trips?
This trip probably came in a close second to the Iceland trip that I went on with Kevin. And that really had more to do than anything with the weather. If you had said to me it's going to rain most of the days you're in Norway, I don't know if I would have said, oh, I don't know if I'm going to go then. I mean, as if I had the choice to back out. But then I immediately remember what a friend of mine likes to say about being outside and wilderness and hiking and such. Gail says, and I don't think she made up this quote, "There's no such thing as bad weather. There's only bad clothing and bad preparation." So even one afternoon, standing over a boulder, eating my sandwich in the rain, I remembered thinking, I'm doing this at the Jotunheimen National Park in Norway. I think its nickname is the Land of the Giants or something like that. And you can't beat it. I had a proper rain jacket. I had my rain pants. And the thing I regretted most, and I don't want to leave people with the impression that I didn't enjoy myself, But I was frustrated that it was overcast and rainy, so it really interfered with getting beautiful photographs. But it was an amazing time. And I think the only thing that comes close as far as other trips, and this would be a trip that I did without Kevin, is when I went with my family to the Southwest. We went to the Grand Canyon, Bryce Canyon, and Zion Canyon. And that was also an amazing trip.
And one I've covered on the show, and I'll put links to that in the show notes as well. All of Fred's photos will be on the website, activetraveladventures.com. So I encourage you to check those out. Fred, thank you so much for coming on the program today. It's been a wonderful experience to see Norway through your eyes. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me, Kit. It's really been fun.
I sure appreciate Fred coming on the program. And now it looks like I've got to put Norway on the list. Maybe 2023 or 2024, I'll go there. You can always check out where I'm heading on the website, activetraveladventures.com/travel with me. That's where I post any tours that I'm doing if you'd like to come along. Now I'd like to answer some of the questions that came up during the show. First of all, about the long tunnel. So I looked that up. That's the Laredale. I'm sure I mispronounced that. It's 24.5 kilometers or about 15 miles long, the longest in the world. And it provides a ferry-free connection between Oslo and Bergen. That's one long tunnel. The other question is, what was a fjord? So I looked that up as well. And according to Wikipedia, it is a long, narrow inlet with very steep sides or cliffs that is created by a glacier. And here was a really interesting thing. All right, so Norway's coastline is estimated to be about 18,000 miles long or about 29,000 kilometers. And it has about 1,200 fjords. But if you exclude the fjords from the coastline count, it only has about 1,600 miles out of that 18,000 miles of coastline. So it's got all these interior fjords, and that's one of the reasons that makes Norway such a magical country to visit. And I'm guessing you were as curious as I was about this other guest on the tour, Nancy. What would make a non-hiker do this? So I reached out to Kevin, the owner of IAG, and asked him, do you remember why Nancy joined you on the trip? And here's his email back to me. If I remember correctly, Nancy was a hiker but had only been on day hikes before. Helping folks make the jump from day hikes to multi-day adventures is one of our specialties. We also included all the necessary rental gear, so there's not a need for investment in expensive equipment. As for why Norway, besides the incredible beauty of the mountains, I think there was largely that this was a hut-based adventure where some of the huts even have a bar and a restaurant, so there's no need to carry a heavy pack, and most folks carry only about 12 pounds. So I'm guessing the extra weight that Fred had mentioned that he was carrying, he probably was getting that a little bit confused with his earlier Iceland adventure. And remember, Fred was a photographer, so his photos of this beautiful country are extraordinary. I sure encourage you to go to the website, activetraveladventures.com, and check them out. Get more information about this and any other adventure that might pique your interest. I've got a great search feature on the website to help you pick what adventure works for you by time of year, activity, destination, even budget, all sorts of different ways to help you find your next great adventure out of the multitudes around the world. I do try on this program to present to you doable adventures. Remember the bar set that me, this 61-year-old body's got to be able to do it if I train. So these are things that you can replicate. So that's what I tried to provide for you on the show. And by working with affiliate partners, the tour companies that I trust and I seek out, I also try to give you a way to implement the trip that we cover on the show. And because of the agreement that I have with them, if you do use my links to get to their website, I do earn a small commission, which helps cover some of the cost of this podcast. I also try to get an exclusive Active Travel Adventures promo code or discount code for my listeners. So it's win-win. And Kevin and IAG have been gracious enough to offer HTT61XS, and that will get you $100 off any IAG adventure. And you can find the code on the webpage for this episode, on the resources page, as well as the show notes. And of course, in the travel planner that I put together for every episode, that newsletter subscribers have access to. I hope this episode has sparked interest in Norway or going on some amazing adventure, so you don't have to Photoshop your face on a fake photo. Until next time, this is Kit Parks. Adventure on!